Welcome back. I'm Jan Mazotti, and you're listening to Driving Force Radio. My co-host is Steve McMillan, the special online projects manager at the Denver Post. And in this segment, we're discussing the outbreak of Listeria that originated here in Colorado. Here to contribute to the discussion are Denver Post reporters Jennifer Brown and Mike Booth. Jennifer is on the projects team at the Post and has been involved in the coverage of the Listeria outbreak and foodborne illnesses. Mike Booth is the healthcare writer for the Denver Post and has covered everything from the U.S. Senate race to drought and water policy, among other news. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jen, can you tell us what happened with the Listeria outbreak at Jensen Farms in southeast Colorado this summer?
Sure. Up to 36 people were killed from those cantaloupes, which had Listeria bacteria probably on the outside of the cantaloupe. They haven't really been able to determine whether it was just on the outside and then dragged through or whether it was actually inside the flesh of the fruit. What the FDA determined after visiting the farm was that Jensen Farms, the two brothers that own the farms, decided to ramp up production a bit, and they bought a potato sorter, which is not appropriate to use for melons, because melons you eat raw. Potatoes are dirtier, I guess you would say, when you buy them at the store, because people cook them and you cook out the bacteria. There were other problems at the farm, but that was really one of the main things that they have pinpointed that may have caused this.
So the Listeria outbreak with the melons last year, were huge. And Mike, there were a lot of implications both locally and nationally to this whole conversation of food and how food is processed. Can you discuss some of that a little bit?
Well, sure. I think what happened with Jensen is that it really reflects a lot of what's going on with the American food system, which is you have a relatively small family farm in Colorado that did employ people outside the family, but a really family-controlled farm that could ship things to as many as 25 different states the illnesses came from. They are not a huge producer nationwide. California is the largest producer of cantaloupes by far. But this one farm, because things are so interconnected now and because you can distribute everywhere, through a distributor called Frontera Produce, we're able to ship these prized cantaloupes from Colorado all over the place. And so illnesses broke out all over the country, and they were relatively easily traced back to the Colorado farm, and pretty quickly, within a couple of weeks, they had that tracing done. But it's talked, now that the FDA has finished their investigation and, as Jen talked about, established what exactly went wrong, it does connect to a lot of other problems that are happening in the food safety system. One of them has to do with third-party auditors. In the United States, we rely on, because the FDA doesn't have enough inspectors to go to every farm every year or even every 10 years. Jensen had never been visited by an FDA inspector until they got into trouble. And most farms in America are not visited by government inspectors. They rely on what's called a third-party audit system, which means, as Congress put it, it's the fox guarding the hen house in a way. You hire as the farm, or your distributor hires someone to come in and check your safety procedures and check a bunch of boxes and give you a score. And the problem is you're paying the bill, and so the auditor doesn't have a lot of incentive to tell you what you're doing wrong and to force you to make corrections on it. And in fact, there's no way to force you to do corrections on it because the government's not involved. So there was a third-party auditor at Jensen that was there on the farm just a couple of days before they started shipping, and they got a score of 96 out of 100 on their audit.
Wow.
And that happens a lot. Jen and I have written about a lot of other outbreaks where people got a great score just before the bacteria started forming or started getting shipped out all over the country.
That's stunning to me. And Jennifer, I want to ask you this. The outbreak of Listeria at Jensen Farms was one of the deadliest since the early 1900s. And my question is for you, how could this happen? There are so many regulations in place, and you hear about so many regulatory bodies and departments and human beings out there that regulate these industries. How could this happen?
It seems like there are a lot of regulations and people out there regulating, but as Mike said, no federal inspector ever came to this farm. What you have are extension agencies that sort of help develop best practices out there at these, locally owned farms in small towns, and they tell you, well, this is the best way to grow cantaloupe, this is what we suggest, and the FDA does have some guidelines for specific produce. They're working on one for cantaloupe, or do they have one already?
There was a guideline in place, but it was very weak.
Right,
Now
so
they're working hard on another one.
They're doing a better one to say this is exactly how you should grow cantaloupe. But really, I mean, a lot of the farms are on their own besides these auditors that they hire to come out and look at them.
Mike, can you talk about other instances of foodborne illness? I know eggs and peanuts recently have caused some problems.
Those are two that a lot of Americans would have heard about because the egg farms have gotten so huge, and poultry in particular, poultry and eggs get concentrated so heavily into sort of a factory farming system that they ended up recalling more than 500 million eggs from just two farms owned by the same company, or by two sister companies in the Midwest, when they started finding salmonella in heavy concentrations. The American food system assumes that salmonella is pretty much everywhere in chicken, and even the stuff that you buy at the store legally has salmonella in it, and it's your responsibility legally as a consumer to cook it out of the chicken or cook it out of the eggs. When things get to a really bad level, they can force a recall, as happened at these two farms in Iowa. That was a notorious one. They also got great ratings from their third-party auditors, and then when the FDA inspectors went in, Jen and I were reading through these documents and reading them out loud because they were so shocking. I mean, literally manure piled so high that doors were falling over, and dead chickens in creeks, and obvious rat infestations and other things in these places where we're getting our eggs from. Poultry meat has some of the same issues. Another one is the notorious peanut outbreak from one of the largest peanut suppliers in America at the time. And what made that one especially grating on people who care about food safety is that they started uncovering documents that the company knew that they were testing for bacteria and getting positive results. And instead of doing something about it and cleaning up, they sought other labs to give them a better score on those tests and to clear it for them so they could still ship it. And so they were lab shopping. And then during congressional testimony, it came out that the president and the other executives of the company were just trying to push the stuff out the door and saying, when are we going to get rid of this stuff? And they didn't mean destroy it. They meant, when can we sell it? Let us know when we can sell it.
You know, Jennifer, a congressional committee looked into the Listeria outbreak and found what appears to be a systemic failure with oversight in terms of farms. In this farm, Jensen Farms in particular, and that there were a lot of hands in the problem, from the grower to the third-party auditors to the FDA to the distributors. What has changed since the outbreak, and will it really fix the problem that this caused?
Honestly, I would have to say not much has changed at all since the outbreak, except that there are a lot of people talking about it. That's a good thing. But before the outbreak, back in early 2011, Congress passed the Food Modernization Act. And basically that is supposed to revamp the system in a way, have more money for regulators and more rules about, looking at one specific type of food, and cantaloupe, and saying this is exactly how you should grow it, make sure it's safe, and several other foods that have been deemed problem foods, if you will. But since then, there's just been a lot of arguing about how they're going to fund this, and so far there hasn't been any money for it. So nothing much has happened with that act, but it's still being discussed.
Mike, with federal and state governments struggling with budget shortfalls, do we really have the money to provide government oversight and enforcement of farms and the food chain? So
far, they have not shown that they're willing to spend the money on that. They've been arguing about, despite passage of the Food Modernization and Safety Act, they have been arguing about whether to fund that for a couple of years now. So the FDA came out with a budget proposal a few weeks ago that asked for a couple of $100 million specifically for this kind of rulemaking, food testing, testing for pathogens on farms. But in order to fund that, they've asked to implement a new fee on most farmers and processors. Then you find out, well, they've already argued about that the last couple of years, and mostly the Republican-led House has declined to do that because they see it as a new fee, a new tax, an expansion of budget that they don't agree with. And so they haven't been able to get that extra funding. And then we found out that they have very quietly, there is one program in the country that actually, from the USDA, that actually goes around and tests for pathogens on farms and has actually caught things like spinach bacteria and before it went out into production in California. And guess which program will be cut? And this is a proposal by the Obama administration, not the Republicans in the House. It's a $5 million program, relatively small, but it has proven effective, and that has already proposed to be cut for next year.
You know, and that seems so crazy when they announced this morning that $500 million is going to be used of federal money to go search for Amelia Earhart. And we're looking at $200 million to really take a look at the foodborne supply chain, the illness supply chain, yet we're going to go look for somebody who's been gone for a really long time. Sorry, that's my own statement there. But Mike, I have to ask the question, should consumers be scared of agriculture, fruit products from the U.S.? If not, why? If yes, why?
I think scared is probably the wrong term. I think concerned. I think Americans in general are thinking more about where their food comes from, and that's a good thing. I think going overboard and being too worried is going too far for most consumers. But there are a lot of people thinking more about how much meat they eat. A lot of people wondering about where the meat comes from, how the animals are treated, not just whether it's safe, but also whether it's ethically fair to animals. So I think that's a good thing that consumers are more aware of it. There are some things that consumers do need to know as a result of what's going on with the cantaloupe outbreak. What Jen and I discovered when we were writing about what the problem was with Listeria is that some of this was a big surprise to home economics researchers. They didn't know that this could cause a problem in this way. And so now they're trying to figure out what to recommend to consumers about how to treat a cantaloupe when you bring it home from the store. And Jen's written about that as well, and maybe she can talk about how they recommend now that you handle a cantaloupe once it's in your refrigerator.
Guys, the last segment we were talking about the implications of the Listeria outbreak, I've just got to ask this question. Have you personally changed the way you shop or the food that you eat?
I think both of us have, and almost everybody we've talked to hears something about it, wants to make some changes. One thing that we talked about in our research that had been bugging us because we didn't know the answer to it. So the good thing about our jobs is we get licensed to go ask all the experts exactly what we should be doing in our own home. So one of them is knowing that chicken in its raw state has a lot of potential for pathogens, salmonella especially. What should you rinse it before you cook it, or does that cause more problems? And so we asked everybody we could talk to, Ohio State, Colorado State, all kinds of people about that. And the answer is don't. You're supposed to cook out the pathogens. When you rinse it in your sink, Jen had written that it can splash up to 6 feet. So you're just spreading potential salmonella all over your kitchen if you try to wash it first. You're supposed to cook it anyway to the right temperature. Chicken is 160, 165 degrees internally. And so that's how you get rid of the pathogen, not by rinsing it first and splashing that water potentially all over your kitchen counters.
The other thing I think that at least I've thought a lot about, especially for my kids, is washing everything that you're going to eat raw as well as you can, and especially if you're going to slice through something like a melon, or even some people who maybe get a little too paranoid about it will actually wash a banana. But if you're going to cut a banana in half and say, here's one for you, here's one for you, like you should actually rinse the banana because whatever is on the peel just went right through it. And then if it sits there, like in your lunchbox or something, that bacteria is just growing on that first bite of banana that you're going to take. So things like that we've adjusted.
And they're trying to figure out with other food safety what you tell different groups of people. So cantaloupe is a favorite fruit for many of us, but also especially among the elderly because it's relatively soft, it's a little bit bland, but it's very healthy. And so what do you tell someone who may not find it easy to lift a 3 or 4 pound cantaloupe and hold it under that sink water and rinse and scrub? So they're still developing these things as we speak and hoping that for the next cantaloupe season, they've got all the recommendations ready to go.
Wow. Mike, I have to ask, obviously you guys have changed the way that you're dealing with food, but has there been any recourse to Jensen Farms or to any of the people in that chain and since the outbreak, and who truly polices the food police, if you will?
Well, there have been a lot of legal ramifications for Jensen Farms and the distributors they worked with. So far, not criminally from the federal government. They were sent a warning letter by the FDA, which is a common practice, telling them everything that they think they did wrong, everything they need to fix if they're going to try and start up again for next season. So far, they have not faced criminal charges. It's a possibility in these kinds of cases, but they have not filed criminal charges in some of the most notorious cases, like the peanut packaging cases. But they face a huge number of private lawsuits so far that probably threaten them with the potential for bankruptcy, as many other food companies have had to file when they're faced with that many different lawsuits. And their distributor, Frontera Produce, has been named in the lawsuits and is actually testing a pretty interesting area of law, because they've tried to draw in all the way down to the Safeway, the Costco, the Sam's Club level of are they responsible somehow for what happened with the cantaloupe? Since they sold it, did they have more responsibility to make sure it was safe when it came off their shelf? That law is not clear yet as to how much they can be drawn in and be forced to pay for some of these private lawsuits.
And in terms of these lawsuits, I mean, we're talking about up to 36 people who died, but there are, dozens and dozens more who are very, very sick. One guy that we met was on his deathbed for months, like pretty much in a coma. He just passed away a couple of weeks ago. And a woman who lost her baby. I mean, it's just something you don't think about. Like you bought a cantaloupe at the grocery store and it killed you. I mean, it's outrageous.
It's unbelievable.
Have local producers implemented their own safeguards?
Colorado farmers are working with the state to try to figure out how to sort of rescue the industry that got such a bad reputation last year. And so they are hoping to band together, possibly tax themselves to create a fund that will fund more safety efforts, such as they will be able to assure consumers that these cantaloupes have been tested for pathogens and that all the farms in Colorado agree to a certain level of growing standards. That's not all finished yet. There's not quite as much money available for that in Colorado. We're really talking about just a couple of dozen farms and farmers, whereas California's industry is 50-60% of the cantaloupe market. But they are banding together to try to figure out what they can do to revive the industry next year.
Are there higher risk commodities that we could see an outbreak? Jen, you said this could happen again. What should people be watching for?
I think the foods on the list of problem foods right now are melons, tomatoes, peppers, spinach is a big one. Any kind of leafy greens tend to hold that bacteria, and those are the biggest problems.
What kind of damage does an outbreak like this do for the farm economy in southeast Colorado?
We could tell immediately that it was going to have a huge impact, just for the way the initial stories started coming out. These cantaloupe that were tainted with Listeria were from a farm in Holly, which is not really Rocky Ford region, but they had branded their cantaloupes Rocky Ford because that's a famous name. Well, when the information started trickling out from the state health department that Rocky Ford cantaloupe might be making people sick, I mean, pretty much everyone stopped buying cantaloupe. I don't know about you guys, but no one purchased them for a while. And the farmers in Rocky Ford were very, very angry, really, at the state health department when it was all said and done, and when they found out it was this farm over here in Holly and not in Rocky Ford. They were upset about their reputation being damaged. And I think we've reported that cantaloupe sales dropped, was it?
As much as half, not just in Colorado, but all over the country, California especially, which is a major producer. And that's common in outbreaks, is for whatever the material it was, whether it's spinach, tomato, sales just plummet for the first few weeks and then take a long time to recover.
Well, and we were just talking about that at break, that the spinach industry has really struggled with coming back. Can you talk about that a minute?
Starting in 2006, there were a couple of notorious outbreaks in what they call leafy greens, which covers spinach and lettuce and a lot of other materials that are a specialty of the Salinas Valley in California. Huge farms there. It's shipped all over the country, fast food joints. So if there's an outbreak, it can spread even more quickly than cantaloupe did in Colorado and to the rest of the country. And so when they had their outbreaks, you couldn't find it on store shelves. And stores are extremely careful because they don't want their reputation hurt, so they pull everything very quickly. And so the sales have still not completely recovered, even this many years later in California from the spinach industry. And what their reaction has been, which Colorado's trying to do with Cantaloupe, was because there is not the money available right now in the federal government to come in and take care of everything and to hire inspectors and go out to every farm, they've banded together, taxed themselves, come up with a pretty severe testing program and restrictions on how you can grow things, even where farms can be located in terms of relation to manure that might come from a beef operation nearby, and really come up with a strict program that then the state has the authority to stop selling things from farms that are not meeting those goals.
Would the Rocky Ford farmers, would they back away from the brand? I mean, at least temporarily?
They love the brand. What they want is some state help in trying to remarket that brand and sort of wall off Jensen's problem as not being a Rocky Ford problem. So now what they're trying to figure out is how much are they going to plant for next year? And imagine you're a small farm. What do you do not knowing who's going to buy your stuff once you've finished it? And you have to plan for something that's happening 6 months from now. It's really tough.
You bet it is. Jennifer, I know one of the up-and-coming conversations that just hit national news last night is this whole idea that antibiotics can't even touch some of these outbreaks anymore. And I know this is a new topic that you're looking at. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this is what I've been looking at is the antibiotic resistant drugs that are used in animals that we eat. And the federal government has a national tracking system where they send people out to stores to purchase turkey, chicken, pork, beef, and they test it and see what kind of antibiotic resistant bacteria are in there. And it's kind of frightening to look at the list of what's in there and what's perfectly okay to be in there according to federal regulation. There's basically E. coli 0157, the one from the infamous Jack in the Box outbreak. That's not allowed to be sold, so you would have to recall that meat. But all different kinds of salmonella that can be deadly and other bacteria are allowed to be sold. They just assume that you're going to cook it.
And Jennifer, where can listeners learn more about the work that you and Mike have done and get more information about food safety as well as foodborne illness and the outbreak?
At denverpost.com/investigations page, we have a lot of this stuff gathered together, I believe, all of our Listeria coverage. Mike's also started a blog called The Daily Dose, which is a lot of information about food safety as well as other health issues.
Well, Steve McMillan, thank you so much for being my co-host today. And Jennifer Brown, Mike Booth, thank you so much for joining us as well. To learn more about the topics on today's show, visit theicosamagazine.com or go to facebook.com/drivingforceradio. Tune in every Saturday to learn what is driving today's leaders. I'm Jan Mazotti. Thanks so much for listening.